The afternoon grew unnaturally still. A dark shape raced across the plains. Towns lay directly in its path. March 18, 1925. Morning light spread across the valleys of southern Missouri. Farmers stepped outside to feed their animals. Children hurried along dirt roads toward small brick schools. The air felt warm, soft, and gentle, the kind of morning that promised a simple spring day. The sky was a quiet blue. A faint breeze moved through dry corn stalks left from the year before. Roosters called from distant barns. No one saw danger in the calm. On porches, men repaired tools. Women washed clothes and hung them to dry. A dog barked at passing wagons. In towns like Ellington and Annapolis, the telegraph wires hummed softly above the tracks of the Iron Mountain Railroad. Trains passed, trailing gray smoke across the open plains. It was the kind of peace that makes people forget how fragile peace is. For weeks the ground had been dry. Rain had not come since February. The soil cracked open like old wood. But people only smiled and said it meant good weather for planting. Around noon, the first shift of wind came from the southwest, barely noticed, a faint smell of dust and smoke. The light changed, a golden hue that seemed strange but beautiful. A farmer in Reynolds County later said the sky looked too quiet to be safe. Yet life continued. School bells rang, blacksmiths hammered iron, mothers baked bread, a church choir practiced for Sunday. No one imagined that in a few hours whole towns would be gone. By early afternoon, small clouds began to gather on the horizon. They rolled slowly, heavy and gray. Crows flew low, restless, uncertain. The wind shifted again, stronger now from the west. Shutters creaked, loose tin on barn roofs rattled. Inside classrooms, teachers noticed the windows darkening. Children pressed their faces to the glass and whispered. Outside, the light dimmed, turning from gold to a pale yellow, then to an eerie green. Still, no one panicked. Spring storms were part of life in Missouri. People trusted the earth and the sky, as they always had. But the air kept thickening. The temperature rose. A strange silence spread, the silence that comes before thunder. Leaves stopped moving. Birdsong vanished. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At Ellington, a telegraph operator paused at his desk. He felt pressure in his ears, like the weight of a mountain pressing down. He turned toward the window and saw clouds forming a spiral, wide and slow. He hesitated, unsure if his eyes were fooling him. Then lightning flashed, without thunder. The sky flickered white. That was the first sign, the first whisper that the world was about to change. By early afternoon, the warmth had turned heavy. Moist air clung to every surface. Men wiped sweat from their foreheads, though the sun no longer shone. The wind came in slow bursts, carrying a low hum that made the trees tremble. In the small town of Ellington, a merchant stepped outside to close the awning over his store. He looked west and froze. A wall of dark clouds was moving toward him, stretching across the entire horizon. The clouds rolled and twisted, turning the sky from green to black. People stopped their work. They stared at the strange light above them. It was neither day nor night. It was a color no one could name. The birds had vanished. The air smelled of rain and something sharp, like metal. Farmers gathered tools and led horses toward the barns. Mothers called for their children to come inside. Dogs barked without stopping. Far away, thunder began to rumble, deep, steady, not like a normal storm. A few lightning bolts flashed within the clouds, pale and silent. By 2 o'clock, the sky hung low, pressing down on the fields. The temperature dropped suddenly. Then, from somewhere far to the southwest, came a faint roar. At first, no one knew what it was. Some thought it was a train. Others believed it was the wind echoing through the hills. A farmer near Annapolis later said the sound kept growing until the ground began to shake beneath his feet. He looked up and saw clouds twisting faster and faster, pulling on themselves like a rope being wound too tight. The air turned a strange gray. Dust and leaves swirled in every direction. The first cold drops of rain fell, large and heavy. They splashed against roofs and windows. But the rain stopped as quickly as it began. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Men gathered outside the general store, staring at the horizon. Someone whispered, "That is no thunderstorm." Then the wind struck, sharp, violent, tearing at hats and coats. Barrels rolled down the street, doors slammed open, shingles flew from the roofs. At the edge of town, a woman hanging laundry watched her sheets lift straight into the air. They vanished into the swirling dark. She screamed for her husband. He turned just in time to see the clouds above them twist into a black funnel. It stretched down from the sky like a living thing. In that moment, the day turned to night. The storm that had begun as a shadow over Missouri was no longer just weather. It had become something alive, vast, furious, unstoppable. The Tri-State Tornado had formed. At 1 p.m., the tornado touched down in rural Reynolds County, Missouri. It began as a thin column, gray against the horizon, turning faster than the eye could follow. Within minutes, it grew wider, pulling dust, trees, and whole barns into its spinning core. Witnesses said it looked like the end of the world, a solid wall of black moving on the ground. The roar deepened, low and constant, not like thunder, but like 1,000 trains coming at once. People who heard it said the sound filled the air and the body, vibrating through the chest. Animals screamed in their pens. Windows shattered before the wind even reached them. A schoolhouse outside Ellington stood in the direct path. The teacher, a young woman named Clara, heard the noise and told her students to get under their desks. She knelt beside them, whispering a prayer. Moments later, the building exploded outward. When the storm passed, nothing was left, not a single wall, not even the foundation stones. The tornado moved northeast faster than any storm people had ever seen. 60 miles an hour, faster than a man could run, faster than a horse could gallop. It grew wider, nearly a mile across, swallowing everything in its path. The air inside was filled with spinning wood, iron, glass, and earth. Some who survived said they saw small houses lifted and carried whole through the air. In the mining town of Beale, families ran from their homes as the sky collapsed. The funnel hit the hills with a scream of wind, ripping trees from the ground and flinging them like sticks. The church steeple twisted once, then disappeared. Men tried to hold doors closed, but the pressure inside their homes blew them open. Walls fell like paper. Everything became a storm of flying debris. A man later recalled seeing chickens plucked clean, cattle thrown into the air, and wagons spinning like toys. Another said the darkness was so complete that he could not see his own hands. He felt the air pulling at him, and then nothing. He woke later in a field, his house gone, his town gone, the landscape unrecognizable. The tornado did not slow. It crossed the Mississippi River with ease, lifting a column of water hundreds of feet high. Observers said the river itself seemed to rise to meet it. Trees snapped like dry twigs. Telegraph poles vanished. Even the air seemed to burn with dust and rain. By the time the storm entered Illinois, it had already destroyed dozens of farms and killed entire families. But the monster was only beginning its march. Ahead lay towns, schools, and factories, and thousands of people who still believed the danger was far away. The Tri-State Tornado was now fully alive, a black wall of wind, nearly invisible until it was upon you, moving so fast that escape was impossible. It was no longer a storm, it was a force of nature beyond imagination. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the black wall of wind crossed the Mississippi River and headed straight toward Murfreesboro, Illinois. The town sat quiet, unaware of what was coming. Children were still in school. Factory workers were finishing their lunch. Miners underground felt the earth rumble, but thought it was blasting from another shaft. Above ground, the sky changed color again, a sickly green-gray that dimmed the sun. Wind rushed down the streets in sudden bursts, tearing loose shingles and scattering papers. Teachers stood by classroom windows, uneasy. One of them later said, "The air felt wrong. It was like breathing dust before the storm." At 2:30, the sound arrived. It rolled from the west, deep and steady, building until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. People stopped what they were doing and looked toward the horizon. A wall of debris was rising, reaching high into the clouds. It was moving fast, faster than anyone had seen a storm move before. In the brick schoolhouse on the south side, the windows began to rattle. A teacher ordered her students to crawl under their desks. She tried to shout over the growing roar, but the noise drowned her voice. The air pressure dropped in an instant. Ears popped. Then the building shook like a ship in a storm. The tornado hit Murfreesboro at 2:34 p.m. In less than 1 minute, most of the town was gone. The schoolhouse collapsed first, its roof torn away, then its walls folded in on themselves. Houses vanished, streetcars lifted and smashed against the remains of the courthouse. Railroad cars were thrown from the tracks like toys. Witnesses said the air was filled with boards, glass, and smoke. A church bell rang once before its tower fell. Fire followed. Small sparks from broken wires and stoves ignited the ruins. Flames spread across the wreckage, even as the wind still screamed through the streets. A man working at the shoe factory remembered grabbing a support beam as the walls went out. When it was over, he found himself standing in open air, surrounded by fire and dust. Nothing remained of the factory. People ran through the streets, calling for their families. There was nowhere to go. The town was a field of rubble. 10 minutes after the storm began, Murfreesboro no longer existed. The center of the town was flattened for more than a mile. Over 200 people were dead. Many more were missing beneath the ruins. The survivors were left in a strange silence, broken only by the sound of fire crackling through the wreckage. Farther north, towns like DeSoto and Parrish were next in line. The tornado had grown again, now nearly a mile wide, its core invisible, wrapped in rain and dust. Those who saw it said it did not look like a funnel at all. It was simply darkness moving forward, swallowing the world. By the time the wind eased, Murfreesboro had become a scar on the map. In that place of industry and music, where families had built their lives for generations, only ashes and twisted iron remained. The storm moved on without pause, leaving behind fire, smoke, and grief. The monster did not stop. It rolled on mile after mile across the open farmland of southern Illinois. The air behind it flowed with fire and dust. Ahead, the land lay quiet and unsuspecting. Cows grazed. Children walked home from school. A few people in the fields looked west and froze. They saw the black horizon moving toward them, wide, low, and fast. At DeSoto, the first warning was a roar louder than thunder, too constant to be the wind. People ran from their homes. A man tried to start his truck, but it was too late. The sky turned black before he could reach the road. Rain and dust slammed into his face. He threw himself into a ditch as the air filled with debris. The tornado struck DeSoto head-on. The main street disappeared. Houses folded inward. Telegraph poles snapped and vanished. At the local school, a teacher herded her students toward the basement steps. Before they reached the door, the roof lifted away. She clung to the stair rail as the wind pulled the world apart. When the noise stopped, the school was gone. Only the steps remained. In Gorham, families saw the dark mass moving across the fields. Some ran for the riverbank, hoping to escape. But the tornado was faster than their fear. It tore through the town in seconds, throwing whole buildings into the air. Witnesses said the wind stripped trees bare and left horses standing without harnesses, stunned and silent. A freight train near Parrish was pushed off the rails, cars overturned and twisted like toys. Telegraph wires snapped, cutting off every town behind it. No warnings could be sent. To the east, people could only guess what the strange darkness on the horizon meant. As the tornado advanced, its core became invisible under layers of rain and dust. From a distance, it looked like the earth itself was rising, rolling forward in a boiling wave. Farms vanished beneath it. A two-story home was carried half a mile before breaking apart. A steel bridge bent like clay. Roads disappeared under piles of wood and stone. People who survived said the air was so full of dirt that breathing felt like drowning. The wind carried sparks from burning homes, scattering them into the rain. Everywhere there was motion, walls collapsing, trees flying, animals running wild through the fields. The world no longer had a sky or ground, only spinning gray. By late afternoon, the tornado had traveled nearly 70 miles inside Illinois. It had passed through 20 small towns, leaving thousands homeless. But it was not slowing. If anything, it seemed to gather strength, feeding on the chaos it created. To those watching from miles away, the storm looked endless. It had no shape, no form, only a line of darkness rolling across the land. And inside that darkness, entire lives were vanishing, unseen and uncounted. At the far edge of the storm, near the Indiana border, people could hear the low growl coming closer. They did not yet know that this same tornado would soon become the deadliest in American history. By the time the tornado crossed into Indiana, daylight had already begun to fade. The storm had been on the ground for more than 3 hours, a path of ruin stretching across 2 states. Rain fell in sheets driven sideways by the wind. The air was cold now, filled with the scent of mud and smoke. In the small town of Griffin, people saw the sky turn from gray to black in seconds. Many had already heard rumors from Illinois, talk of entire towns destroyed, but few believed them. The radio gave no warning. Telegraph lines were down. There was only the strange quiet that always came before the end. A man named Thomas was fixing the roof on his barn when the wind changed direction. He looked up and saw a wall of darkness rising above the fields. There was no funnel, no lightning, only motion. He ran for the cellar and slammed the door behind him. A moment later, the barn was gone, pulled apart by the invisible force above. Griffin was struck just before sunset. The tornado tore through the center of town, destroying every building in less than a minute. A church collapsed with its evening choir still singing. The school was flattened. People were thrown hundreds of yards through the air. When the wind moved on, silence returned. A silence broken only by cries for help and the distant ringing of a bell that no longer had a tower. In Princeton, farther north, families huddled in their basements as the roar passed overhead. Houses shuddered, windows burst inward. Then came the pressure, that crushing weight that made breathing nearly impossible. Many later said it felt like the air itself was trying to pull their lungs out. Outside, the tornado carved a path through the countryside, scattering barns and fences like straw. Lightning flashed inside the storm, lighting up walls of rain and swirling dust. It looked like a living mountain rolling across the land. When it finally began to fade, the wind slowed but did not stop. Heavy rain followed, washing mud and debris across the fields. By the time the storm lifted near Petersburg, Indiana, it had traveled more than 200 miles without pause. In its wake were thousands of ruined homes, burned fields, and towns erased from the map. No one knew where the storm had gone. Some believed it had dissolved into the clouds. Others said it had simply kept going, searching for more land to take. Night fell over Indiana, dark and wet. Families searched by lantern light through piles of wood and brick. Mothers called out the names of their children. Men dug with bare hands, pulling friends from the wreckage. The air was thick with smoke and rain. Everywhere there was the sound of grief. When morning came, the people of Indiana stepped out into a landscape they no longer recognized. Their fields were gone, their homes were gone, and the tornado, the storm that had crossed 3 states in one endless march, was finally gone too. When dawn came, the light revealed a world that no longer made sense. Fields that had been green with wheat were now a desert of broken timber. Houses lay scattered in pieces across miles of open land. The silence was complete, as if sound itself had been taken by the storm. In southern Illinois, the smoke from burned homes still drifted upward. Families wandered through the ruins, calling out names. Some found loved ones alive beneath the wreckage. Others found only fragments of what had been their homes. The air was filled with the smell of wet wood and fire. Murfreesboro was a sea of splinters and twisted iron. The shoe factory was gone. The church bell lay half buried in the mud. The streets were covered in bricks, wires, and glass. Cows and horses wandered aimlessly, their barns destroyed. People moved slowly, stunned, carrying what little they could find. In DeSoto, rescuers dug with shovels and bare hands. A mother screamed when they pulled her child alive from the ruins. Beside her, others wept silently as small bodies were carried away on doors and blankets. The school steps still stood, the only sign that a building had once been there. At night, fires burned from fallen lanterns and broken stoves. Rain turned the ash to mud. Men searched by lantern light, guided by voices and the faint glow of the flames. Doctors came from nearby towns, treating wounds in barns that had survived. The injured lay on blankets, covered with coats and quilts. In some places there was nothing left to bury. Whole families had vanished, their homes carried miles away. A man near Gorham found his neighbor's piano resting upright in a cornfield 2 miles from where it had stood. Another found a photograph pinned by a splinter to a tree, the only trace of the people who once lived there. The rescue trains began to arrive the next day. Men with shovels, nurses, and volunteers from St. Louis stepped down into what looked like a battlefield. They brought food, blankets, and medicine. But there was no order, no way to know where one town ended and the next began. Everything was ruin. Journalists described the scene as a landscape erased. Photographers tried to capture it, but the damage was too wide, too endless. Even from the air, it looked like a scar carved straight across the land. Still, survivors worked through the wreckage. They built fires for warmth and cooked whatever food they could find. They shared bread, water, and stories. In the middle of that destruction, small acts of kindness began to appear. A man lending his coat, a woman holding a stranger's child. The storm had taken almost everything, but not the instinct to help one another. When the sun set again, the horizon glowed orange through the haze. The world was quiet, except for the distant sound of hammers as people began to rebuild. No one knew how or when normal life would return, but they kept working because there was nothing else to do. As the smoke cleared, reporters and officials began to measure what had been lost. They walked through the fields with notebooks, counting what could still be counted. What they found defied belief. 695 people were dead. More than 2,000 were injured. 13 towns lay in ruins. Hundreds of farms had vanished, their soil scattered across miles of countryside. The tornado had stayed on the ground for more than 3 hours and crossed 219 miles, the longest continuous path ever recorded in the United States. In Murfreesboro alone, 234 people had died. DeSoto had lost nearly 1/3 of its population. Entire families were missing. The Red Cross called it the worst natural disaster in the nation's history up to that time. But numbers could not tell the story. They could not capture the weight of what it meant to lose a home, a child, or a town. Every number hid a name. Every statistic hid a voice. A photograph of a smiling couple found in a ditch. A child's shoe washed clean by the rain. A single piece of wood carved with the initials of a man who would never return. In the weeks that followed, newspapers across America printed lists of the dead. Names filled entire pages: farmers, miners, children, teachers. Readers scanned the lists, hoping not to find someone they knew. Others searched for familiar faces among the photographs printed beside the stories. President Calvin Coolidge sent a message of condolence to the governors of the 3 states. Churches held services for the victims. Donations arrived from across the country. Trains brought supplies, coffins, and tents for the survivors. Doctors from Chicago and St. Louis volunteered to work in makeshift hospitals. For months afterward, bodies were still being found in fields and rivers. Some were never identified. People erected simple wooden crosses where houses once stood. At night, candles burned in the windows of the few homes that remained standing. They were small lights in a dark landscape, reminders that the living had not forgotten the dead. Historians would later study the storm for its power and scale, but those who lived through it remembered something different. They remembered the silence afterward, the still air, the pale light, and the terrible emptiness that came when the wind was gone. The Tri-State Tornado left behind a record of destruction that numbers could never explain. It was not only a storm of weather, it was a storm of lives, a tragedy written across 3 states, one name at a time. After the storm, scientists and weather observers tried to understand what had happened. In 1925, meteorology was still young. There were no satellites, no radar, and no system to warn the public in time. Weather forecasts came from telegraphs and barometers read by hand. The idea of a tornado staying on the ground for more than 3 hours seemed impossible. Experts from Washington and Chicago traveled to the region. They studied the path, the wind direction, and the damage left behind. They found that barns had exploded outward, houses had been lifted cleanly from their foundations, and grass itself had been ripped from the soil. Steel rails were twisted, trees stripped of bark, and iron bridges bent like paper. It was as if the laws of nature had been rewritten. The scientists debated what had caused such a storm. Some said it was a collision between cold air from Canada and warm Gulf air moving north. Others thought it was a perfect alignment of jet streams and pressure systems. But the instruments of the time could not confirm it. The tornado was too fast, too violent, and too far beyond anything they could measure. In the years that followed, the storm became a legend among weathermen. They called it the Tri-State Tornado, and it haunted every new student who studied severe storms. Generations of meteorologists tried to model it, but even with modern data, no one could fully explain its speed or strength. It remained a mystery, the greatest tornado ever recorded in American history. For survivors, science came too late. They did not need charts or theories. They remembered the sound. They remembered how the air turned thick, how the sky fell, how the world became dust. A farmer near Murfreesboro later said, "It was not just wind, it was the earth itself moving." Today, researchers use radar, satellites, and supercomputers to track storms like this one. Warnings can reach millions within minutes. Entire towns can be evacuated before disaster strikes. Yet even with all that knowledge, nature still holds the power to surprise and destroy. The Tri-State Tornado stands as proof, a reminder of how fragile civilization is against the sky. What happened that March day was not just a weather event. It was a lesson written in wind and ruin, a moment when the balance between humanity and nature tilted, and for 3 terrible hours the wind ruled the earth. In the months that followed, people began to rebuild. The fields were cleared of wreckage. New homes rose on the same foundations where old ones had stood. The scars of the storm remained, but so did the will to continue. In Murfreesboro, volunteers rebuilt the school first. They wanted children to have a place to return to, a symbol that life would go on. Families shared lumber and tools. Neighbors worked side by side, lifting beams, laying bricks, cooking food for the workers. The town that had been wiped away by the wind began to take shape again, one wall at a time. In Indiana, survivors planted new crops, though the soil was still scattered with bits of glass and twisted metal. Men fished furniture and fences from rivers miles away from where they had been. Women stitched quilts from torn clothing, turning rags into warmth. The simple act of rebuilding became a way to heal. By the next spring, grass had grown over much of the ruined ground. The wreckage was buried, but the memory remained. People spoke of the sound, that deep roar that still echoed in dreams. They remembered how the air had changed, how the sky had fallen, how the world had gone still afterward. For decades, families told their children the story of the day the wind came. They told it quietly, with respect. It was not a story of fear, but of endurance. The storm had taken nearly 700 lives, yet it could not take the courage of those who remained. Every year, on the anniversary of March 18th, small towns across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana hold moments of silence. They ring bells, lay flowers, and read the names of the lost. No music plays. Only the wind moves through the trees, and for a moment it feels as if the land itself remembers. The Tri-State Tornado of 1925 became more than a line in history books. It became a warning and a testament, a story of nature's fury and human strength. Out of destruction came compassion. Out of darkness came light. And in the quiet after the storm, people learned once again that survival is not only about living through the wind, but about finding hope in what remains.